All right, there we go. Um, Hello, good evening. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Rachel Hanson, and this is Introduction to Gender Studies. Now, our module this week is called Work, Worth, and Who's Doing It. We're really going to be spending some time talking about gender, race, and the distribution of labor. Now, as we go along, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. I am monitoring that kind of off to the side here. So if you see me looking towards the ships, I'm just checking to see if there's any comments. If there's anybody new in the class that needs to be welcomed. So there's that. Let's just dive right on in. I hope you'll forgive me, one more kind of just little nugget of housekeeping. You might not be able to tell from my attire. My arms get really hot, but it is winter in Minnesota, and dry skin is the name of the game. Uh, Now, over these last 12 weeks at this point, um, right, the class is free, the resources are free, the lectures are all free, and that is going to continue to be the case. But of course, it takes a lot of time and a lot of work to create this. So, if you want to maybe provide some financial support without subscribing to the Substack, um, I'd encourage you to visit my link tree, and it's link period tr/Rachel A. Hanson. Um, there are a few like commission-based links over there for services that I use. I think special for the next few weeks here is Hulu. And I just finished watching Only Murders in the Building, season 5, and Instacart, which is a really helpful service for me when sometimes I just run out of time in my weekend and we still need food in the house. So if that's something you'd be interested in, I'd encourage you to hop on over. Um, Now to the actual module itself. Where we're really talking about, again, gender, race, and the distribution of work. Now, this might seem really familiar if you've been along for the whole time, because it's very similar to our conversation just a few weeks ago about feminism and parenting. Because as it turns out, parenting is also a pretty tremendous amount of work. So, that's just how it goes down. Now, we're really starting in with what I would describe as a foundational academic article um, about how we think about work and who's doing it. And that's Class, Gender, and the Relations of Distribution by Joan Acker. Um, now, Acker wrote this article in 1988, which was already a pretty happening year for feminist theory. One of my personal favorite feminist theory concepts, um, politics of location, also kind of started getting its roots at this time. Now, we haven't talked about politics of location in this class, but I'm hoping that maybe in subsequent semesters, that's something that I'll talk about a little bit more because I think it's just super cool. I really like talking about it. Um, Now, Agar really lays a solid foundation for us to understand how capitalism, that's the economic system that we live under here in North America, really depends on both visible and invisible labor. And I would say maybe more to the point, paid and unpaid labor, which again, we talked about a few weeks ago. Now, she talks about how gender and class aren't separate systems. They actually work together to help us understand how work is mm, excuse me, valued, compensated and recognized. Um, Now, she really starts out by talking about unpaid domestic labor, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. Um, right? Like, I was loading my dishwasher right before I came up to start doing the Substack Live. Um, because you just gotta get done, like that's just the name of the game. Um, but even within something like domestic labor, um, it is less now than it was in 1988, but it is still gendered and classed, right? Um, and one thing that she talks about, which was extremely germane for the time, um, was that middle class women could choose to really just fully opt out of the paid workforce and do that unpaid domestic labor that really is like critical to keeping the family running, basically. Well, working class women could not afford to do so. Now we are living in a time now when I don't know many families that can afford to live on a single income. And so I would argue then that we are living in a time now where most families are working class families. And that's kind of regardless of the job that you have or the education that you maybe needed to get that job or what have you. Um, the other thing that I think Acker doesn't talk about this super explicitly um, necessarily, excuse me, but there is a racial component to this as well. Um, Now, as I was preparing for this, I started thinking about this experience that I had. Um, I want to say maybe like 2008, 2009 ish. Um, it's been a while ago now. So you may or may not remember, depending on how old you are. But um, there was a lot, I mean, a lot of white feminist discourse um, really just being downright terrible to Michelle Obama for referring to herself as her most important job being mom in chief. Uh, White feminists were not happy about that, even a little bit. And I remember having an online conversation with somebody that I'm no longer in touch with. Um, Basically just talking about how I thought it was really great that she could um, take some time to just focus on parenting. Now, I could not have articulated this at the time. Um, but now, how I would describe that, thanks to really some excellent friends that were gracious enough to educate me along the way and through my own efforts, really, frankly, how revolutionary it is for a Black woman in the United States to have the luxury of prioritizing parenting. Um, because we really are living in a space and a time where white women are just waking up to the fact that rural income households and juggling childcare and all of that stuff has been the reality for our Black neighbors forever, right? Um, and so there's this racial component to it. Um, but there's also, regardless of race, this dynamic of unpaid domestic labor also really has a very strong undercurrent of subservience into it, right? Um, because the family wage ideal tells us that what we should be aspiring to is for the man in the family, because of course we're also assuming that this family is uh, kind of checking all of the heteronormative boxes, earns enough to support his wife and however many children they have. Um, and that really is an economic disenfranchisement for the women in this scenario because right, they're economically dependent on that man, regardless of the quality of man, right? Um, which is really not ideal. Now, further than this, right, even beyond just domestic unpaid labor, Becker also spends a lot of time talking about how women's work, first of all, that we have a concept of women's work, um, but that it's also segregated by sex. Um, out there in the professional world, uh, where women, especially at that time, but this I mean, remains true, right? 37 years later, um, that women are broadly concentrated in low paying jobs that maybe aren't especially mentally challenging. Um, whereas men really are occupying like very like deeply technical roles and managerial roles. And another thing that we see is that as professions have evolved, professions that initially were maybe socially coded as clerical, um, and I'm thinking about like computer programming as a really good example of this, right? Thinking of that as clerical and then realizing that it was highly technical, we see that profession shift from women doing it to men doing it. Um, right? I feel like it's kind of the same idea as, right, at home, women do all the cooking. Um, but if you think about a famous chef, you are almost definitely thinking of a man, right? Um, for whatever reason, my kids are super obsessed with Gordon Ramsay recently. So if you're anything like me, you're thinking of Gordon Ramsay. Um, but and so like, as we're thinking about these jobs, even in industries that maybe are dominated by a specific uh, socioeconomic class, men and women are experiencing different labor conditions, right? Um, where the wage gap is still a thing, um, and women who are um, maybe visibly doing more to prioritize their families um, are perceived that as less dedicated and therefore have less autonomy in the workplace. Kind of like, continuing on here, um, right? I know I mentioned just a few minutes ago about that economic dependence concept. Um, that really is kind of a key part of patriarchy as we're living under it now. Now, this is not to say that patriarchy can't evolve and change. I hope that it does. Um, but broadly, the system that we're living under now um, means that economic dependence is kind of paramount to the whole system. Um, and so, in times like most times, right, when women are working for money, it's been a tremendous struggle to earn enough money to support the family. Now, this is despite the fact that even uh, you know, previously and now, Black women, for example, are almost always the primary breadwinners in their families. Um, and so it really reflects how we value work and how we value the people who are doing the work. And then that kind of brings us to the programs that we have, at least in the United States, to kind of fill that gap, right, between the money that you earn and the resources that you need to get by, right? Um, Acker talks about um, this welfare program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, um, which is what this program was called in the 80s. We would now in the United States call this Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, P-A-N-F. P-A-N-F. Um, and these programs are gendered and are really often assuming women as caregivers and men as breadwinners. Um, and so then we kind of take a look at how benefits from the government are structured. Um, and so we see, right, like benefits that are tied to wage labor or military service, for example, of course, are going to disproportionately favor men. Um, while the benefits that maybe are socially coded to help women are means tested and are very often linked to marital or parental status. Um, and so then we see, right, like even in an environment where the wages are not sufficient uh, to get by, the means of making up that difference are deeply gendered to make it more difficult for people. Um, Really not even to thrive, but just to live, right? Like to like a little bit get by. And so those policies, right? Because all of this is a policy choice, really reflect our values, uh, whether we might realize it or not. Um, Now, this brings us into our second reading or piece of media for the evening. Um, as a podcast episode of the Double Shift called On Not Having It All. Um, Now, before I just start talking here, I do want to give a little bit of content warning. This podcast episode discusses pregnancy loss. So if you are not in a place to hear me talk about this or to hear Catherine Goldstein, who is the host of this podcast, talk about that, um, now would be a good time to step out. We'll probably be talking about this for about 10 minutes. So, if you want to come back for the last thing, um, or if you don't, that's fine too. Um, Now, the double shift has been on the air or in our earbuds for about 6 years, right, since 2019. Um, and in this particular episode, Goldstein talks about her own story of career transition, shifting family dynamics, and the pressures of being taken seriously in a changing industry. Um, right, because again, kind of same as that chef example from earlier, uh, when you think about a podcaster, who are you imagining? Um, if you're not a person who, like me, who kind of geeks out over podcasts, I would not be at all surprised if you were picturing somebody like Joe Rogan. Um, Although I honestly, I hope you're not listening to him. Like, None of us need any of that. Um, but so for a woman to be taken seriously in podcasting, I know a ton of women who will tell you it's a tough game out there. Um, but when Catherine was starting the double shift, she did an incredible amount of work to prepare her show for a podcast network, um, while also dealing with an unexpected pregnancy and then the subsequent loss of that pregnancy, um, where she was told there in the moment that podcasts about working mothers were tired. I heard that line in the podcast episode. And as a mother myself, I went, mothers are just tired. And rather than meaningful help or support, um, the people who could make a difference just tell us that we are superheroes when maybe we don't want to be. Um, now she really digs into her experience of the labor, um, both physical and emotional, of the whole journey of getting the double shift, excuse me, up off the ground. Um, but really, her experience reminds us that hard work is not the only factor that determines success. Again, who is doing the work profoundly shapes how it's received and how it's rewarded. Um, Now, here at the end of this, I just want to give you a minute to stop and think. Within the fields that you work in, whose labor gets recognized and whose goes unnoticed? Now, our last thing for this evening um, is a TED Talk that feels a little bit like it might be coming right out of left field. So stick with me because I think that is worth it. Now, this TED Talk is Brian Stevenson's We Need to Talk About an Injustice. Now, Stevenson spends most of his roughly 15-minute TED Talk talking about how community is the solution to mass incarceration, which I literally could not agree more with. Um, but that's not why I chose this TED Talk. Um, Now, Brian Stevenson is a lawyer, and he, if I understand correctly, he represents children who are being tried as adults in the legal system. Um, and that on its own is just bananas, to put it lightly. But that's even a thing that would be present in anybody's judiciary. Um, but Stevenson was representing this 14-year-old boy, and he was tired and he was frustrated. And he filed a motion, excuse me, he filed a motion asking the court to treat his 14-year-old black client with the same compassion and grace that would be shown to an elderly white man who had committed the same offense. Um, the judge was not happy about this. And as he was talking to Stevenson, about his displeasure. People are filling the courtroom as they are wont to do, right? They're public places. Broadly speaking, you have the right to be in a courtroom, right? Um, but among those was a custodian for the building that Stevenson had talked to on his way in to the courtroom. I don't think that I need to tell you that the janitorial staff in any building are literally what's keeping us going, right? Um, if you've been in the office and the rest of that tuna fish sandwich in the garbage doesn't get thrown out at the end of the day, we all know there's going to be a revolt. Um, I'm noticing a typo here in the module as I'm kind of going through it that I'll have to fix when we are done. Um, I'm not actually sure how that happened. Huh, go figure. Um, just a real human moment happening here on camera. When the bailiff recognized the custodian who was there in the courtroom, um, he mocked this man for um being present in the courtroom, basically insinuating that he had no right to be there. Of course he did, right? Um, and uh, the custodian encouraged Stevenson to keep fighting the good fight, basically, and was present for the case. Now, in the TED Talk, we don't know the outcome of the case, and I haven't looked it up, so I have no idea. Uh, but it's this reaction, right, that we see again how the work is valued and how it's valued based on who is the one who's doing it, right? If we're going back to my tuna fish sandwich example from just a couple of minutes ago, a minute ago, I don't know, time has no meaning. And it was, um, if the bailiff had taken out the garbage, you best believe that he would be expecting to receive some accolades for doing this terrible task. Um, I say this is somebody who does actually need to take out the garbage in her kitchen and has not done so for a couple of days. So there's that. But this is really what we're talking about when we talk about unequal labor across gender, race, and class. Is that the work that everybody is doing, society has agreed is necessary on some level to be present for society to continue to function. Um, and that could be unpaid labor, right? Like the dishes that I did right before sitting down to talk about this. Um, and I'm just gonna keep using my labor as an example here. Um, right? So it could be the dishes. It could be the work that I did at McDonald's as a teenager. And now as a working parent, I am so appreciative of those folks at McDonald's. Because sometimes that's how dinner is happening, but also because I know how hard it is. Like, um, that is hard and low wage labor. Um, right. We agree that that is something that is necessary. We all know that janitorial staff are absolutely necessary. Um, right. And moving on up, right? The jobs that we do and the labor that we perform, whether we um, need education to do it or not, um, on some level, everybody has agreed that that labor is necessary for the functioning of society. Um, so until we can see that all labor is equally valuable, um, equity is going to remain out of reach for us. Now, as we're closing out this week's module, I do have a few things that I'm hoping you will think about. The most important, whose labor makes your daily life possible? I do think about all the people that maybe even before you roll out of bed in the morning, that make it possible for you to go about your day. Um, the next is if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to share them. You can share them on this post when it goes, when the recording is live on Substack. You can share them on the written module. Um, these are also going over to YouTube and um, LinkedIn. So, all over the place there. Now, I am really excited to be talking to you next week on, I gotta look at my calendar. Yep, on the 19th about popular culture. Um, it is one of my favorite feminist things to talk about. And I know I said that at the beginning of this about politics of location, but um, that's just how it goes down sometimes. I have a lot of favorite concepts. And I will see you next week for our penultimate introduction to gender studies lecture. So I hope you, ooh, excuse me. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.